Welcome to Checking Your Reserve Pay, Part 9, a beginner's guide to verifying your service director pay. My name is Jesse Matthews. I am your local 4094 Reserve Committee Chairperson. Just a quick disclaimer before we proceed. This presentation has been provided to you on behalf of the Reserve Committee at QP Local 4094, and it's intended as a guide without prejudice or precedent. Having said that, if there's any variation between what's in this presentation and the collective agreement, or any applicable legislation or policies, then the collective agreement, legislation, and those policies will take precedence. The union reserves the right to change this presentation, to add to it, to delete it, and to correct errors and omissions within it without notice. If you are aware of any errors or omissions within this presentation, please let us know at reserve@local4094.ca, and we will do our best to incorporate them. With that, let's get on to the presentation. So just a quick overview of the flight summary. Most of what is in the flight summary as far as within flight information as seen on this page and within flight duty credits as seen on a subsequent slide. Most of that's been covered in the Part 1 video that I've previously done, but we'll go over a few of the points as it relates to us here as service directors, just to make their purpose completely clear. So INDX under flight information refers to index. Every entry that we have in flight information is essentially a schedule-related activity. So this is index item 1, and then within flight duty credits, which we'll see a little later on, the entries in that table are matched by the same index number. All of the items related to departure and arrival times, we won't need to review that. That's the same as before. What I will point out that's a little bit more important for us here as service directors is EQP stands for equipment, as in the type of aircraft that you are flying on, because that is of relevance to us as service directors when calculating pay. A little bit more on that later. I'd also like to draw your attention to this particular column. EMPSTAT is short for employee status. So this essentially is the position that you worked as far as your classification for each activity item that you have. So you'll notice at the top of my flight summary that I am classified as a service director for this particular month. And for the most part, you would expect that my status on flights is also service director. You do see in each case within this particular flight summary that I am showing as service director for all of my activity, but it's possible that you can be reclassified for one flight leg or more as a flight attendant instead, for example. And in that case, that would have implications on your pay for those segments, and we'll cover that a little bit later on. SVC-CD, that is short for service code. This is a particular number that is tracked within HR Connects and is also used on our flight summaries, and that tells us what step we are at within the pay progression for service directors. It's a little bit of a smaller scale than it is for flight attendants. There are in fact only 3 steps, but we'll cover that a little later on. The important thing is you can see what step you're being paid at in this column for any of your activity. Desk is short for description, so it's describing what that activity is, essentially when it's anything other than an actual flight. So for example, in this particular row for index 5, we have Toronto to Houston, and there's nothing in the description, so that's essentially just the flight itself. Whereas if we go one above to index item 4, we see DPG. So this isn't for an actual flight, this is for duty period guarantee. So what's in this column makes it clear what the pay minutes are for when it's not just a flight. Similarly, we have sickness as an activity for index 2, so that would be logging any time that you are off of payroll temporarily when you're ill. And in my case, as a union representative, I do get union releases on occasion, and union bus is just short for union business, so that classifies this as not a flight, but rather union business I was conducting. And on line 12, for index 12, we do see standby-res, that's short for standby on reserve. So you can see that there are different descriptors that are in this particular column, and usually it clarifies anything that isn't explicitly a flight. And finally, we see pay minutes as an overarching subtitle for 3 different columns. We'll just focus on one of the columns because that's all that we need. In the past, there used to be different rates of pay for flying during the day versus at night, but that's no longer the case. So really, we can just look at the total. The total is going to be the number of pay minutes we're interested in as far as what we are paid. So 780, for example, would be the number of pay minutes applicable for index item 1. We can see 240, that's equivalent to 4 hours, and that would be for the airport standby on line 12. And then we can see the absolute total of 2,668 minutes. That applies for my flying activity and related activities for the May block month. For the math geeks out there, you may have noticed that everything is in minutes, that we don't use the hours plus minutes format on our pay or our flight summaries, so we have to do a little bit of conversion once in a while because we're used to thinking about things in terms of hours and minutes, especially when looking at Globe. And the problem with that is when we are calculating pay, it's done per minute, and it's not always the easiest to divide and multiply in time format. Time format described mathematically would be what's known as base 60, whereas when there are decimals, that's called base 10. So we have to convert back and forth between those sometimes to calculate most accurately what we're going to be paid. And we'll briefly review how that works. So for example, in Globe, my projected hours are showing as 24 hours and 58 minutes. And I would want to make sure that I am paid for all of that time in minutes on my flight summary. So we would have to convert from base 60 to base 10. So for example, we have 24 hours and 58 minutes. So we would want to change those hours into minutes, and that's easily done by multiplying 24, that's the number of hours, by 60, and that converts it into minutes. That would be 1,440 minutes, and then we of course know that there are 58 minutes that already exist, so we would just add those 58 minutes to the 1,440, and that gives us a total of 1,498 minutes that we'll be looking for. To do it backwards, in other words, going from minutes to hours, you would divide the time by 60. So in this case, we have 1,498 minutes, and we want to divide that by 60. What we get when we do that is we get a number with a decimal number. So we get 24.96667. The problem with that is that we don't think of time in a decimal system. That is, we don't think of time in base 10, we think of it in base 60. So the 24 we know is correct as far as the number of hours is concerned. We just have to change this decimal number. So we take 0.9667 and we multiply that by 60, and that gives us 58, and that's the number of minutes. So you then combine 24 hours and 58 minutes, and we get 2458 in projected hours. So we have the same thing backwards all over again. Being able to do this conversion between hours format and minutes only format, that is essential when checking our pay on our flight summaries, just to make sure we're getting everything we're entitled to. So we talked before about flight information as that first section on our flight summary, and this is more or less akin to our schedule, so what we've done during the month. The next section that we see in our flight summary is called flight duty credits, and this is how we are paid for all of that time that we have accrued over the month. As we mentioned before, index, INDX, that links both sections. So the index 1 that we see in flight duty credits corresponds to the index that we see in flight information. And how do I know that for sure? Well, we see that for index 1 within the flight information section, there are 780 payable minutes for that index item. And if we look over at flight duty credits, we see that same 780 over here. And that would be within the pay min column, and that's short for pay minutes. So that links both sides for us for sure. Within flight duty credits, we also have EQP. So that's equipment, just like we saw over in flight information. So we are seeing that the 220 rate should be used for the pay minutes that we have here. And that would be something we want to verify using the table that I'll show you on the next page. This here would be the pay rate that's used with those minutes. And essentially all that you end up doing is taking the pay minutes and then multiplying them by the rate. So 780 times 1.04917, that ends up equaling $818.35 for that particular activity. I'd also like to draw your attention to a similar but not identical column that we see in flight duty credits. So here we see pay stat, and that is short for pay status. This is not quite the same as employee status. And we'll cover a little bit of why that is the case a little later on in this presentation. There are some scenarios where you could be flying as a flight attendant and end up being paid at a particular service director rate within your flight summary. We'll cover how that works. The important thing is EMPSTAT is employee status under flight information, so what you're coded as flying, so service director versus flight attendant. And then over here with pay status, it will show you what you are classified as far as your pay is concerned for that index number. And we'll cover the nuance on that just a little later on. So how do we verify exactly what our pay rate should be for each of these index items? We're going to cover that on the next slide. Each aircraft we operate has an associated pay rate with it. All of these can be found in the collective agreement in Article 5.04 and Article 5.05. All narrow-body aircraft, with the exception of the Airbus 321, have a 3-step pay scale that maxes out after 3 years. So we can see at the bottom of this infographic that there are 3 steps, and we know that because there's 3 service codes. So there's 01, 02, and 03. 3 being the highest of the service codes, so the last step on that scale. On the other hand, if we look at the Airbus 321, we can see that there are all three together on the same line, so 0, 1, 0, 2, and 0, 3 for service code, and that means that you immediately max out on the pay scale whenever flying the Airbus 321. And the same can be said for the 767 and the 330. All three service codes are together on one line, so you're already maxed out right away whenever you fly that aircraft type. And then, of course, the same for the 777 and the 787. All three codes are on one line, so you immediately are at the maximum rate whenever you fly that aircraft type. So it's a little more straightforward in the sense of fewer steps on the pay scale. For flight attendants, as you can see further up in this infographic, there are 14 steps to progress through. So just 3 for us as service directors. When you start out as a service director, you are placed by default at step 1 if you have less than 5 revised years of service. So that would be corresponding to service code 1. If you have 5 revised years of service or more, when you start out as a service director, you are placed at step 2, and that corresponds to service code 2. You'll never start out at step 3. It's always going to be either step 1 or step 2. The reference for this to give you an idea would be Article 5.06 in the collective agreement, which has been included in the screenshot here a little further down. Just a small additional note, any time spent on layoff, for example, or other time off due to, say, a special leave of absence or an extended period of time on WIP, if that's for more than 15 days in a month, then your pay progression will stall by 1 month as a result of this extended time off payroll. The contractual reference to find this would be Article 5.13.04. That's beyond the scope of this video to cover in detail, but just so you're aware, extended time off payroll does play some role in determining which step you start out at when you're a service director. So once you become a service director, if you fly as a flight attendant, you are contractually entitled to pay at the very least at your applicable step on the narrow body pay scale. The reference for this is Article 5.12.02, which we have included on this slide for your convenience. Most specifically, it would be this section here. So the difference is Article 5.12.02. This refers to when you are reclassified to a lower classification as a one-off. So you are not flying as an FA for the entire month, for example. This was something that happened when service directors were being recalled from the COVID layoffs, was they would spend a month classified as assistant purser, and that had different implications for pay. Whereas when you are classified as a service director for the month and then fly as a flight attendant, it's considered a one-off, more or less. So the language from 5.12.02 would apply. Whereas if you have been reclassified for an entire block month, so your default for the month is something other than service director, then some of the provisions laid out in Article 5.06 would apply. For the most part, nowadays it's a one-off when flying as a flight attendant, so Article 5.12.02 would apply. And that means, practically speaking, at the minimum, even if you fly as a flight attendant, you should be getting, if you were at step 1 on the narrow body pay scale, for example, you should be getting $62.95 an hour at the very least, even if you're flying as a flight attendant. Or if you were at step 2, then at the very least $67.95, even if you're flying as a flight attendant. Or if you're at step 3, then $71.60 per hour, even if you're flying as a flight attendant. Note that sometimes the rate that is given to you when flying as a flight attendant might be different to this, but this is what you're entitled to at the very least. Every year, this infographic PDF with all of the current pay rates is uploaded to AeroNet for your easy reference. And they usually go into effect on April the 1st of a calendar year. So the rates that we are currently using in 2023 at the time of the publication of this video, they went into effect on April the 1st of 2023. And new pay rates will be in effect on April the 1st of 2024, and they would apply from that date going forward. For now, these are the ones that are in effect, but they change every year. As mentioned, as a service director, you are paid by aircraft type. This is a key difference between how we are paid as service directors and how we are paid as flight attendants. You can see that on the 3 different steps on the narrow body pay scale that there are different rates of pay for the Embraer, which we don't fly anymore, the Airbus 319, Airbus 320, the Boeing 737 MAX, and the Airbus 220. Airbus 321 has its own pay rate. The Boeing 767 and the Airbus 330 has its own pay rate, and the Boeing 777 and the Boeing 787 has its own pay rate. Note the special asterisk comment that is at the bottom of this infographic. And these are flights where there are 2 service directors. So if you are on, say, a 777 going from Vancouver to Sydney, Australia, there are 2 service directors on that flight. So you would not be getting the $85.30 per hour for that flight. As per this note, you would be getting the $82.25 per hour rate for that flight. Same thing would be for Toronto to Delhi, for example. That's a 2 service director flight, so it would be $82.25 per hour for that flight, even though you're flying on the 787, and that's based on the note that's provided here. Sometimes what happens is you might be working a single purser flight, and you end up getting paid the 2 purser rate by mistake. So it's a difference of, at least for this particular year, it's a difference of approximately $3. So getting paid $82.25 per hour by mistake instead of $85.30, and that means you should be verifying your pay rate for all of your wide body flights in particular, and making a pay adjustment e-claim if you find something off. Let's look, for example, at index item number 10 in my schedule for May. We can see in the equipment column that for this flight from Toronto to Calgary, that I was on the 787. This is a single service director flight, so I will be getting paid accordingly at the 787 rate. We would expect that to be $85.30 an hour, or since we do everything in terms of minutes on our flight summaries, that would be $1 and about 42 cents per minute. So if we look at the corresponding index item under flight duty credits, so that would be 10, we can see it's been encoded as service director on the 787, and the rate that's being used is in fact $1 and approximately 42 cents per minute. So this is correct in terms of $1.42 per minute multiplied by 259 minutes. And that gives us our lovely grand total of $368.21 for that leg, and that is correct. We have what's known as a prorated minimum monthly guarantee adjustment if our total pay minutes in a reserve month are less than 4,500. 4,500, that would be your MMG, but expressed in minutes as opposed to hours. So you can always see what your MMG is in Globe. But again, it's expressed in hours in Globe, so you would need to convert that using the method described before, and that's just multiplying 75 by 60. And that would get you that lovely total of 4,500. We can see when looking at pay minutes within my flight information for the May month, when taking all of these different index entries and adding up all of the pay minutes, we get a total of 2,668 minutes, and that is of course less than 4,500. So there will be an MMG top-up that has to be calculated, and we're going to explore that on the next slide. So how do we do our adjustment for minimum monthly guarantee? We subtract our total pay minutes, so in other words, what we've already flown, from our basic minimum guarantee, which always starts out as 75 hours, or for the purpose of pay, we need that in minutes, and that's 4,500 minutes. If we've had a reduction of any kind transpire during the reserve month, then there is a reduced minimum guarantee that would be applicable instead. So how does this reduction happen? Essentially, when you are sick, so that means you are off payroll, when you're on a personal leave of absence, if you're unavailable for duty on reserve, and so on and so forth, that would be time off payroll. And there is a deduction of 2 hours and 25 minutes. This reduces your MMG. As a service director, your MMG adjustment is prorated by aircraft type operated during the month. So what does this mean in practice? This means that because you are paid by aircraft type, if you fly a portion of your flight time in a month on, say, a 787, and then the rest of your flight time on narrow-body aircraft, that creates a ratio of what kind of flying you did through the month, and that same ratio is used to pay your top-up. So there's a little bit more math involved, but that can get you some extra money in your top-up when you don't complete your flying hours for the month. If we look at my minimum monthly guarantee adjustment, you'll notice that indeed 4,500 minutes is the start of my basic minimum guarantee, but there's a reduced minimum guarantee calculation that is showing in my flight summary. I am showing that I was only available for 27 payroll days out of a possible 31 total days in the block month. And as a result, that means I was off of payroll for 4 days in that month. My reduced minimum guarantee is 3,920 minutes instead of that 4,500. Assuming that is correct, we would take the 3,920 minutes. That's the amount that I should be paid as a guaranteed amount of time for the month. We see from the last slide that the 2,668 minutes are here, and it's a simple exercise of subtraction to figure out how much I need to be paid in my MMG top-up. So 3,920 minus 2,668 is in fact equal to 1,252. So assuming my reduced minimum guarantee is correct, that would be the amount of time that I need to be paid for in my top-up. So where did this deduction come from for me? We need to make sure that that's actually correct before we go on to calculate the prorated top-up. So let's go to the next slide and figure out where that reduction of 4 days came from. The answer, in my case, is related to sick days. Regardless of whether you have any sick days remaining to be paid out, your MMG is reduced by 2 hours and 25 minutes, which expressed in minutes only is 145. For each day, that reduction happens, and that factors it out of your prorated MMG calculation. So let's have a look for sickness. In my case, that would be index item number 2. And we see that there's an activity of sickness that started more or less at midnight on May the 13th, and it ended at midnight on May the 16th. So we see that for index item 2. And then we go over to flight duty credits to look at index item 2. We see something a little bit different. Notice that for the majority of items in flight duty credits, we see a number of payable minutes. So there are 780 minutes, for example, that are payable for index item 1, and 390 payable minutes for index item 3. We see something different for index item 2. We see instead that there is a number that falls within a column known as AE days. So the takeaway point for this is that sick days are calculated in units of days as opposed to in units of minutes. Now, in order to calculate a minimum monthly guarantee and any sort of adjustment, you have to be able to work in units of minutes. But our contract talks about sick days being paid out in units of days. So the solution that's been come up with at Pay is to take out any time that you are sick in units of minutes. So that would be 145 minutes as far as each day that you were off of payroll. And then still using the original unit of calculation, that would be days, to determine what you are paid for those sick days. So as long as you have sick days, you're still going to be paid for your time off payroll sick, but it won't be a part of your MMG calculation. So in that case, we see that there are 4 days removed from the MMG calculation, but those 4 days are still paid out under flight duty credits, and we see it paid out in units of days. So the number obtained for each day was $176.68 per day for the time spent off payroll sick. So then 176.68 times 4 would be the number we're looking for, and that is equal to $706.72 that we see paid out within flight duty credits. Where did this $176.68 come from as far as the rate used? There's a fairly complex formula that's described in Article 9.05.02 in the collective agreement. The takeaway point for this is if you want to determine what your rate per day booked off sick would be, it would be best to reach out to FA Crew Pay to get an exact calculation. The easiest thing to do is you can look in units of minutes for each day that you're off sick, remembering that 145 minutes is the amount of time that's represented in units of minutes on your flight summary. Multiply that by 4 in this case, and then you would take that number and multiply that by the narrow body rate applicable to you. So for me as a service director, in my first year, it would be $1 and approximately 5 cents per minute that I am paid to fly on narrow body aircraft, as long as that amount of pay per minute times 145 times 4, as long as that number is equal to or less than what I am paid out for my sick time, then I assume that to be correct. But if you want to double check that, that would be best to reach out to FA Crew Pay for that. And that's beyond the scope of what this video intends to address. Just to give you an idea, Crew Pay will be the best resource to determine your exact rate per sick day, if you have any questions about that. Let's move on to calculating our minimum monthly guarantee adjustment, so that lovely top up. We have to look at a few key parts of our minimum guarantee adjustment portion of our flight summary. And one of those is EQP. So that's equipment, just as it is everywhere else in our flight summary. But that would be the equipment pay rate. So it's not necessarily the aircraft type you actually flew on, but rather the aircraft type that corresponds to your pay rate. So for example, for my month in May, I flew twice on the 787 as one service director. That would be index items 10 and 11. And I flew on those for 259 minutes and 231 minutes respectively. Those two numbers added together equal 490 exactly. You will notice when going to flight duty credits that both of those were indeed paid out at $1 and approximately 42 cents per minute. That corresponds to the very last line that talks about being paid at the 777 and the 787 rate. You're not going to see both of those aircraft types in the minimum guarantee adjustment table. You'll just see one, and usually that's going to be the 777 in practice. So this doesn't mean that you flew the 777, but that you're getting the pay rate that corresponds to the 777 and in our case, the 787. So what we check here is we want to make sure that the number of minutes that we flew are accurately encoded in this category. So indeed we see 490 as far as the number of minutes that were payable in this category for the flying month. We know that 2,668 minutes is the total number of minutes that we were paid for our flying that we actually did. So that would be the other number to help determine our ratio. So 490 over 2,668, that would be correct. So we know that portion of the calculation is all done correctly. We then have other as the next line for equipment. What do we mean by other? Other is a number of things, but what it is first is it is all of our narrow body aircraft, all of them including the Airbus 321. And this is for reasons I still don't understand entirely, but I can tell you it is based on the contractual wording in Article 5.11.01, specifically in the note that is seen there. And this is a long-standing practice as far as our pay is concerned, that even though the Airbus 321 has its own hourly pay rate when you actually fly on the Airbus 321, it's considered a standard narrow-body aircraft for the purpose of your MMG calculation. So to give you an example, you can see in index item number 9 that I flew on the Airbus 321. We can see when paying me for the actual time spent flying on the 321 that $1 and approximately 24 cents per minute was the rate that's used, and that does correspond to what we have in the table for our aircraft type pay. But when we factor in all of the minutes that we have flown to determine our ratio of flying, the 321 does not get its own line within the minimum guarantee adjustment table. It is lumped in the other category along with everything else. So that means that all of the index items for my month from 1 to 9 are going to be considered a part of the other category, and then also everything as far as standby minutes are concerned from index item 12. So indices 1 through 9 and then 12, all of those minutes, they count in the other category. So when adding all those up, that indeed does come out to a total of 2,178 minutes out of the 2,668 minutes that I flew during the month. So then that means that this too, for pay purposes, is considered correct and ultimately is paid out at that $1 and approximately 5 cents per minute in our top up. Again, even though the 321 is paid out at the higher rate when we actually fly, it's not used when calculating our top up. A couple of little additional points. Airport standby is always paid at the applicable narrow body rate to you. It will never be paid in a category above that. And then similarly, items such as union business, those will be paid at the applicable narrow body rate as well. That does not get paid over and above. So that's the first part of calculating our MMG. We have established that the ratio is correct. So when we look at this first line within the adjustment, expressed in terms of a percentage, this would be 18.37%. So a little over 18% of our flying that we actually did in the month was on the 787 within this pay category. And then everything else, so all the other flying that I did, and then my union business time and the airport standby, that was represented in other, and that accordingly encompasses the remainder of the flying, which is close to 82% of my activity for the month. These, of course, added together equal a perfect 100%, so we know that all of the minutes are accounted for. The rates for each we've discussed already, so those are already there ready to be used. And then the last part would be the number of minutes that we have to get paid in our top up. And this is where having the percentage is key. So we have 1,252 minutes. We don't pay all of those minutes at the 787 777 rate. We also don't pay all those minutes at the narrow body rate in this case. We pay a percentage of them based on what we flew during the month. And that's what we mean by proration. So we need to find the prorated number of minutes that are to be paid out at the 777 787 rate. So for the first line, we take that 18.37%, and then we multiply that by the 1,252 minutes. And then the last step is we take that number and we multiply that by $1.42167 per minute for that. So we take that as well. And when all those are together, so that's 18.37% times 1252 times 1.42167, we get a grand total of 326.88. And that corresponds perfectly with the number that we see here. Similarly, with the 81.63% that's to be paid out for the narrow body rate, we would take the 81.63%. We then multiply that by 1,252 to figure out how many of those minutes should be paid at the narrow body rate. And then we multiply those minutes by the narrow body rate, so $1 and approximately 5 cents per minute. And then that gives us a grand total of $1,072.31. And that corresponds with the other number that we're already showing. When you take both of these numbers and add them together, you end up with $1,399.19. So in my case, my MMG adjustment was calculating correctly. And there's only one other thing to do, and that's to look at the grand total amount that was paid out within my flight duty credits. So that would be $3,705.26. And we will want to add that to the minimum guarantee adjustment that we just finished calculating. And when we do, we get a grand flight duty credit total of $5,104.45. So this again has been done correctly based on the current practice. So we'll start by talking about a few other principles that are not always easily understood. So we're going to talk about two types of ground duty credit. The first type is ground service to passengers. Note that for ground duty credit in general, it is paid at 1/2 of our standard hourly rate. They will talk in our contract or in documentation about being paid by a factor of 50, but the easiest way to think about this is you are paid at 1/2 of your standard hourly rate. You are able to e-claim for ground service to passengers. That would be, say, water service or headset distribution, and this is claimable for a minimum of 30 minutes that starts from your original scheduled time of departure all the way up to your actual time of departure. And that's based on what we find in the contract in Article 5.09. You will need to substantiate any e-claims related to ground service to passengers within your OBR. And the place to do this is in the category of crew feedback, the subcategory of ground duty, and then ultimately you would choose delay. You can also search your OBR to add an issue just by typing ground duty. You should be able to find delay and then 3 other types of ground duty. But the best one to use for this type of e-claim would be the delay. Note that as per our collective agreement language, any ground service performed is either partially or entirely absorbed by any DPG, so that's duty period guarantee, or THG, that's trip hour guarantee, that's already present in the duty day or the pairing. If you happen to want to see how much of your ground service is absorbed, by DPG or THG, you would multiply your DPG or THG by 2. That essentially converts that time into ground time instead of air time. And you would see how many minutes are absorbed from your e-claim. In practice, I wouldn't worry about doing this. I would just let CrewPay make that calculation for you and for all of your crew members. Because pairings change so much, we have mixed pairings where we are a service director with flight attendants for maybe one leg or two before they go to a different service director and a different pairing, and then you would have a hard time tracking their eligibility for ground service to passengers when they have different pairings altogether to you. So if you just file the ground service, when you do it, you can let CrewPay determine the eligibility for you and the rest of your crew. They will automatically calculate and let you know if any DPG or THG has absorbed your ground duty, either partially or entirely. This is a completely normal way of going about things. It's ultimately their job to figure out how much you're entitled to. But you need to file the claim and then let them do the rest. Also, I've put in just flight attendant number 1 and 2 and 3 within my example creation here, but you'll see actual flight attendant names when you add them to your e-claim for ground duty. What you're not always going to see is the number of minutes that they are approved for. I believe that is for privacy reasons. So you won't see any remarks about what rate they're paid at either. What you will see is if they've been approved under status, and that's all that we're looking for. And as long as you see approved, then you'll know that they've been paid something, and that's based on the individual calculation that's been made for them by CrewPay. The second type of ground duty credit that we file for is what's known as post-duty credit. You can e-claim for post-duty credit in situations such as waiting for passengers requiring wheelchair assistance, transferring any unaccompanied minors over to a customer experience specialist at the airport, the deplaning of deportees from your flight at the end once everyone else is off, and so on and so forth. And unlike ground service to passengers, post-duty credit is claimable for any amount of time that you're required to remain on duty following the end of your duty day. And this is based on the language found in Article 5.08 in the collective agreement. Note that this is not at the end of every flight within your duty day. It's specifically following the checkout time for your final flight in your duty day. That's why it's called post-duty credit, is because it is after your duty day is finished. During your duty day, post-duty credit is not claimable. Just the same as with ground service to passengers, you need to substantiate this type of e-claim within your OBR. Again, it would be in the category of crew feedback, the subcategory of ground duty, and then the most applicable category to use is other, and that's because post-duty credit, there was only recent arbitration as far as the way that this is to be paid, so we don't actually have a dedicated category for post-duty credit just yet within our OBRs. And similarly, there actually isn't a specific post-duty credit category within e-claims when you're making an e-claim. So when you e-claim for post-duty credit, you'll want to explicitly include within the body of your ground duty claim that you're making a post-duty credit claim as per Article 5.08. I also include the grievance number whenever I write my post-duty claims, but that's not necessary. Just as long as you make it clear that it's a post-duty credit claim and the article number for it, then that gets the message across. Post-duty credit is paid in addition to DPG or THG that's present in the duty day or pairing. So the DPG and THG does not absorb post-duty credit claims like they do for ground service claims. So essentially any amount of time that you were on duty following the forecasted end of your duty day, you would file for that time. So you can see in my case that I filed for 10 minutes of post-duty credit in eClaims, and that was indeed paid out. Ultimately, it's showing me as approved. Just as with the last example, you won't see individual information as to what the flight attendants are paid out, but as long as you are showing approved for all of them, then that's the most important thing to look for, is to make sure that it's approved for them. Unlike ground service to passengers, post-duty credit would apply equally to you and your flight attendants if it's the end of your duty day. So you would be expecting it to be approved for everyone if they have the same end to their duty day. We're going to talk about several advanced principles. And the first one we're going to talk about is your rate of pay for DPG, and that is your duty period guarantee. As a service director, your pay rate for DPG is based on the aircraft type of the final flight actually operated within your duty day, and that's based on Article 6.02.02. Let's use a recent example pairing that I have here. We have V7213 on July the 4th. For the first leg, so that would be 114 from Vancouver to Toronto, this was operated on an Airbus 330. And you can see that under the equipment code, when we look in our flight summary, it shows 340. That's because we used to have a 340 in our fleet. We no longer do, but 340 and 330, they have the same pay rate, and it just happens to show the same thing there. But you can see that the aircraft type is encoded as that Airbus 330 rate. You'll notice that the second flight is a Deadhead. We'll cover Deadhead later, but the gist of it is because it's a Deadhead, we have duty day -4 that comes into play as far as the amount of flight credit we got, which is 7 hours and 14 minutes. It requires a top up because of the amount of time that we're on duty. And you can see the top up expressed in the DPG area there as 1 hour and 18 minutes. And on our flight summary, we see the DPG entry on line 2. 1 hour and 18 minutes expressed in minutes is 78 minutes. So that's all accounted for there. And you'll notice that 340, so that would be the Airbus 330 in this case, is the aircraft type pay that's used for DPG. Even though, if we look at the information for flight 129, within Globe we see that it was on an Airbus 321, but it doesn't matter because based on the language in Article 6.02.02, the pay for your DPG is based on the aircraft type of the final flight actually operated. So we didn't operate flight 129, we deadheaded. So 114 was the only flight we operated. It was on an Airbus 330, so DPG accordingly for that duty day is paid at the 330 rate. And this is reflecting in my flight summary. If we go to index item 3 within our flight duty credit section, we can indeed see that the 330 pay rate is being used here as well. So that same $1.37 per minute is the rate that's being used. If we multiply that by 78, we do get that amount of $106.92. So this has been correctly paid based on the contractual language. I'd also like to point out that while the pre-post time where you're required to show up more than 1 hour before departure, while this does count towards your duty day limitations, it does not count for the calculation of your DPG, and that's based on Article B5.03.01. So what do we mean by this? You may have noticed that for duty within Globe, I'm showing 1242. And then for time away from base, I am showing 1232. What a lot of people do is they take their duty day, so in this case 1242, and they subtract their FTC, so 714, to figure out the difference between the two. So in this case, we would have a difference of 5 hours and 28 minutes between the length as far as the duty day limitations are concerned and what we've been paid in FTC. We know because of the rules of duty day minus 4 that we are supposed to have only 4 hours of difference between our FTC and our total pay. So if we subtract 4 hours from 528, then you would think that we would get a top up of 1 hour and 28 minutes in most cases. That's the math that people usually do. Unfortunately, this is not correct as far as our contract is concerned. You can see that we have 118 here, and by the math that we just did over on the left, we see 128. So why is there a difference in 10 minutes, and why are we not paid those 10 minutes? And that lies in the wording in Article B5.03.01. As far as our DPG is concerned, we have to start 1 hour prior to departure for the first leg of our duty day. So flight 114, the scheduled departure time was in fact at 13:10. So it was a 9-minute delay on that one. So even though Globe is showing noon precisely as the check-in time, that's basically indicating that according to Globe, you need to show up an additional 10 minutes earlier than the standard 1 hour. But in reality, your duty day for the purpose of DPG calculation actually starts at 12:10. So if you take 12:10 and go all the way to 12:42 a.m., that is a total of 12 hours and 32 minutes, and that is reflected in the time away from base portion of the summary within Globe, and it would be based on 12:32 that you would make the duty day minus 4 top-up calculation. So in this case, we see, looking over at the TFTC for the pairing, so total flight time credit, that 8 hours and 32 minutes have been paid, and that is precisely 4 hours less than the time away from base. And that's based on, again, the language found in Article B5.03.01. Note that even though your time away from base for the purpose of DPG is 12:32, your duty day is in fact longer for the purpose of duty limitation. So as far as choosing between DOT and walking, your earlier time that you show up prior to 1 hour is indeed factored in to the calculation of DOT. That would be something to cover in detail in another video that's beyond the scope of this one. But just so you're aware, the calculation of DPG does not include the extra time prior to 1 hour. The next advanced principle is similar, and that will be related to your THG pay rate. If there is THG on your pairing, it is based on the aircraft type of the final flight actually operated within the entire pairing, and that's based on Article 6.02.02. So we can see that the very last flight that I operated was on July the 23rd, and it was flight 103 from Toronto to Vancouver. When I look for that in my flight summary, that would be within index 15. And you'll notice that I flew on a 787 from Toronto to Vancouver. And if I look in my flight duty credits section, we will see again that there is the 787 for the equipment. There are the 299 minutes that I indeed flew as per my flight information. And you'll see that it was paid at $1 and approximately 42 cents per minute. So when multiplying the 299 by 142, we get that correct number of $425.08. But what we want is to see that our THG has been paid at the correct rate. So because this leg, the very last leg within that pairing, was paid at the 787 rate, that means that any applicable THG for this pairing also has to be paid at the 787 rate. And it doesn't matter what I flew before that final leg to calculate that. So you'll notice that for most of this pairing, actually, it started on July the 19th. So the very first actual flight leg is represented by index item 11. I flew on a 321, and then on a 321 the next day, a 737 on the third day, and the 787 was on the very last day, the fifth day, coming back to base. And because it was the last leg, you will notice that for the line that's payable for THG, that's index item 10, that 787 is used, even though almost all the pairing was done on different narrow-body aircraft. The THG has to be paid out at 787 because of the fact that the last leg was operated on the 787. So if we look under flight duty credits, we look at index item 10 to match the one that corresponds to THG. It's for 232 minutes. That would be the 3 hours and 52 minutes expressed in minutes format. So that would be 3 times 60 equals 180 plus the 52 that already exist in those 3 hours and 52 minutes. And we get that total of 232 minutes of THG. So that all lines up in that sense. We have the 232 minutes in pay minutes over here. Within flight duty credits, we see those same 232 minutes. We see the 787 for the aircraft type to be paid at. And if we multiply 232 by $1 and approximately 42 cents per minute, that is our 787 rate. And that will get us a total of $329.83. So that has been paid correctly because the 787 rate was used. Just like with DPG, the pre-post time where you show up more than 1 hour before departure, it counts towards your duty delimitations, but does not count for the calculation of THG. This doesn't really come up often, if at all, when you are calculating THG. It would really make a difference of perhaps 1 or 2 minutes in THG pay for the pairing at the most. But this is not really something you'll have to worry about calculating for THG. Does not come up really ever. I will also point out that only one of THG or DPG applies in a pairing. The easiest way to figure out which one does is if there is THG that exists for a pairing, then no DPG is payable. So for this particular pairing, I had 3 hours and 52 minutes of THG payable. So you would ignore any DPG for any of the duty days within the pairing. So mathematically, your THG, if you have it, is always going to be benefiting you more than paying out DPG. So THG overrides DPG because it means you're getting paid more than the DPG would have given you. And then finally, we're going to talk about an advanced principle that is quite often confused, and that's because there's no direct language for it in the collective agreement. It's based on the current practice at CrewPay that has been in effect for quite some time. And there's a slight counterintuitive set of logic to it until you get used to it. And then it becomes very straightforward when you're checking in the future. The main takeaway point is your pay rate for deadheading is not at all based on the aircraft type that you deadhead on. And the logic used for that is because you're not really working, you're being positioned. So the pay rate for you couldn't possibly be based on the aircraft type you're on. Also because you could be deadheading on, say, an Air Canada Express flight. It could be an Air Canada Rouge flight, which would include equipment that we are not qualified on and don't have pay rates for in our collective agreement. So logically speaking, it couldn't be based on the aircraft type that you deadhead on. So instead, there is a different practice that is used to determine how you are paid for deadheads. So if you operate after your deadhead, meaning that you deadhead on your first leg and then operate on your second leg, the pay rate for your deadhead is based on the aircraft type you operate next. And this applies whether you operate and then that's after your deadhead in that same day, or it could be you deadhead on one day, have a layover, and then operate on the next day. In that situation as well, the deadhead rate would be based on the aircraft type you operate next. And that's how we have the additional point that the next aircraft type may be in the next duty day rather than the current one, and the same principle applies. That's the default rule. But what if you operate a flight and then deadhead and your pairing is done? You're not going to have a next flight within that pairing to consider. So in those cases, when the deadhead is the last leg, the pay rate is based on the aircraft type you operated before your deadhead. And just as in the default set of rules, the previous aircraft type might be in the duty day prior rather than in the current one. So you could operate a flight on day one and then deadhead back on day two, and that deadhead would need to be paid at the aircraft type that you operated on the previous day. So whether it's the same duty day or a separate one makes no difference. The principle stays the same. I'll give you an example from my flying schedule in July. So flight 114, as we discussed on a previous slide, that was an Airbus 330. And we do see that for index item 2 within the flight information section. And we do see that for index item 2 within flight duty credits that it has in fact been paid at the $1.37 rate per minute. As previously discussed, DPG, that's already been covered. What we're going to get at is the deadhead portion of the flight information here. So you will notice that it's been encoded in the 330 category. Even though, if you look in Globe, you can see that the aircraft type was an Airbus 321. And that is demonstrating the principle in effect here, that we do not pay deadheads based on the aircraft type that we are deadheading on. In this case, because there's no aircraft type that you operate on after Flight 129, there's only the Flight 114 beforehand. We have to use the pay rate that was in effect for the flight we actually operated. So when you look at index item 4, you can see that indeed the 330 rate is in effect for this deadhead as well. So 153 pay minutes times the $1.37 per minute comes out to $209.74 in terms of what we've been paid. So how do we know that those 153 minutes are correct? Remember that deadheads are paid at 50% of the actual time or the scheduled time. So you'll see that this flight 129 was scheduled as 5 hours and 6 minutes. The actual flight time was 4 hours and 38, but we have a principle called scheduled or better as far as how we are paid. So even though we're under schedule by 28 minutes, we have to get paid at least 5 hours and 6 minutes. We need to convert that. So 5 times 60 gives us the number of hours in minutes. And that would be 300. And then, of course, we add the 6. And that gives us 306 minutes. But because it's a deadhead, we don't actually get paid for all of those minutes. We get paid for half of them. So if we divide 306 by 2, we get 153. And that is the number that we see in pay minutes. So that means that our deadhead has been paid out correctly for the correct number of minutes. This is the end of our introduction to service director pay. I do intend to make a future video covering a few more nuanced points, including how vacation pay is determined, but I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we will see you next time. Thank you.